Welcome back to Law&Crime, everybody. I'm Jesse Weber, and thanks for joining us. We are currently live right now in the Jennifer and Joseph Rosenbaum case. These two former foster parents who are on trial for abusing and murdering children. So basically what they're on trial for is connection with these two young girls, sisters, Millie and Layla. Layla died. They claim that she choked on a piece of chicken. The state says no, she died as a result of physical abuse. And then there's Millie, who actually testified last week, and she described being spanked by Jennifer Rosenbaum with a belt on her bottom region. Very disturbing case. Now, today is all about the DFCS, Department of Family and Child Services. On the stand just now was Tamara Warner-Smith. She is a former foster care supervisor who was actually terminated from her position, along with a caseworker, Samantha White, for failing to do the claim is for failing to do what they were supposed to do to protect these children. Now, the defense was in an interesting position just now, cross-examining her. And although this witness was fired for her job and criticized for not doing enough, the defense said, well, in your opinion, you didn't observe abuse. What you saw didn't rise to the level of abuse. And we're breaking it down right now, trying to understand exactly this argument with criminal defense attorney Matthew Maddox. Now, this is interesting, having these witnesses come on, because they're facing their own repercussions, including civil suits.
Yeah, and it's interesting. As I said earlier, they are kind of unnamed co-defendants. They are actually defendants, or she is a defendant in a civil action. This is a really, really difficult and delicate matter for the defense to cross-examine on, Jesse.
Let me ask you this. I mean, especially in this case, there were signs that something was wrong in this household. Even the biological mother, Tessa, said she felt something was off. That's why she began recording the conversations with Jennifer Rosenbaum. How does this go on? How does this go on? I mean, is there a presumption that there's no abuse and that you just don't want to jump in prematurely? I would seem to suggest you're putting children in the house of strangers.
Look, how this goes on, Jesse, is we have Department of Family and Children's Services and the equivalent services all over the country. They are understaffed. They have overwhelming caseloads, and the tragic reality is that children become neglected by the very agency that is charged with protecting them from neglect.
Yeah, it's tragic. But again, this is all, they are presumed innocent, these defendants. They're saying they never abused these kids. It was all a result of just falls that they had, or accidents, or gymnastics. We're going to go live right now. Mary Evans Vattel, she's an assistant district attorney. She was just called by the state. Let's go live. All right. Now, the reason this is important is because when you look at this case, it's alleged that did she put pressure on the agency to have these children put in the care of the Rosenbaums? Matthew, this is like explaining day. We've heard from the DFCS. We heard from somebody who was fired as a result of this case. The question is, what happened here? I mean, did they bypass the system to make sure this child was put in the care of the Rosenbaums?
Yeah, if we're sitting from one of the jurors' seats, Jesse, this all just sounds really confusing and so strange, right? We've got the supervisor, we have the caseworker, we have this assistant DA, and the jurors are trying to understand what happened with these agencies and this particular defendant. And it seems like we got some pretty positive testimony here. Was it so positive, and was her relationship so strong that she was able to influence things? That sounds like where the state's going. Yep,
that's the question. We'll have to see what happens with the cross by the defense. But I'm also joined here by forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University, Joseph Scott Morgan. Joseph, I'm so happy to have you on. I've been waiting to ask you this question since we started this case, so I'm going to ask you right now. Is it possible, because I think this is the real big issue here, is it possible for somebody to do resuscitation efforts of a 2-year-old who's choking, and those efforts would lead to the kinds of injuries sustained by 2-year-old Layla? Or is this abuse? I'm curious your opinion.
In answer to your first question, Jesse, no, and again I say no. It is an empirical impossibility to literally transect the pancreas during resuscitative efforts unless the individual was just so manic while they were doing it and had no understanding of human anatomy. Maybe that would explain it. This child has got all these other peripheral injuries that when you tie all of these back together, it paints a very, very bleak picture.
Well, if the jury hears what you just said, Joseph, that is a strong move by the prosecution. Okay, so Matthew, let's start with you. We're listening to her role in this whole horrible scenario, and now she's being questioned by the defense. Where are they going here in light of what we just heard under direct?
Well, the defense is going to want to show that, that despite whatever personal relationship apparently existed, that there was something going on in that office that was perhaps biased against particularly Mrs. Rosenbaum. That's what it sounds like to me.
Yeah, and I mean, again, the question is, did everyone play a role, an unfortunate role in the death of this young girl? That's the question here put forward by the state. But the defense has a lot to go with here. But I want to go back to Joseph now about the actual cause of death. And to go back, so the question I asked you earlier, Joseph, was whether or not these life-saving efforts could explain some of these injuries. You said no. Let me ask you this. The cause of death from the abdomen, a transected pancreas, is it possible that this might have occurred as that she might have these injuries, sustain these injuries, but she did choke nonetheless? Tell me what you think about that.
Yeah, if you're talking about a child that's physically compromised, I suppose she could have choked, but I think that the question would be, where's the evidence of that in her airway? Was her airway actually occluded, or was it an external asphyxiation? And, we have to be very precise with our language when we begin to discuss these things. You've got a child that's already diminished, Jesse, so moving forward, it's not going to take too much to push her over the edge.
Absolutely, and we're talking about a 2-year-old girl. Hey, Matthew, let's start with you. Was it inappropriate what she did by, again, the idea is she helped facilitate, even by writing an email, the idea is she put pressure on the agency to put those kids in the custody of the Rosenbaums. She said she's been cleared of wrongdoing, basically, and there's been no fallout, but you tell me, did what she do, was it wrong?
From my perspective as a defense attorney, and having interns in our own office here, I think it was highly inappropriate. The entire relationship was excessive and inappropriate, Jesse. I just don't know whether this is really being comprehended by the jury. I don't know whether the DA here is really being aggressive enough to tell that side of this story.
Well, the story that we're getting is at the beginning, the Rosenbaums seemed to be the right people to take care of these children, but soon after, or even before they officially went into their custody, there were question marks being raised. Joseph, let me ask you this. You've covered a lot of these different cases. Are there similarities in this one where you see the end result, this kind of abuse, this alleged abuse in the foster care system, and ultimately tragically resulting in the death of a young girl? I mean, are there similarities that you're seeing here?
Yes, there are. The government is not the best watch care. I've worked cases. I can reflect back to working cases with the ME's office in Atlanta and the coroner in New Orleans, where the defects in this case has just completely fallen apart. You would have multiple children in a house, and each one of them would have separate caseworkers, and the left hand wouldn't know what the right hand was doing because it's so disordered. There's so many disaffected children that are out there. You can't keep up with them all. And of course, that we're not talking about a piece of property here. We're talking about a child's life. And of course, the child winds up suffering, and sometimes they wind up paying the ultimate price. Yeah, we're talking about a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old. We can't forget about Millie, her older sister, who's also been a victim in this case, an alleged victim that she has suffered abuse as well. She took the stand last week. Welcome back to Law and Crime, everybody. I'm Jesse Weber, and thanks for joining us. We were just live in the Roy Coons Jr. trial out of Tennessee, the man who's accused of killing his 12-year-old neighbor, Johanna Ortega. It's alleged that he strangled her to death. Now, we have just learned that the defendant will not testify. We had just heard from his father, who took the stand for quite some time. I want to get some final words from criminal defense attorney Matthew Maddox, who's joining us back here. I got to ask you, we listened to the entirety of the state's case. They said, look, he had the opportunity to kill her. There's a text message from her saying that this man
showed up at her house, from the victim saying, oh, I think it was the man who cuts the yard, indicating that might be Roy Coons. But the DNA evidence is not really that strong. We don't have a confession from him. We don't have an eyewitness pointing him to the crime. Has the prosecution proved beyond a reasonable doubt at this point that Roy Coons Jr. killed Johanna Ortega?
I don't see the state having met its burden of proof here, Jesse. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt. They've got some circumstantial claims here. I'm not even going to call it evidence. The DNA evidence is, as you've already said, really unimpressive. I don't think the state's met its burden.
Well, we are going to wait to see because we're expecting closing arguments in that trial later on today. Matthew Maddox, thanks so much for coming on. Appreciate your insight as always.
Thanks for having me here.
All right, everybody. So we're going to switch gears right now, and we're going to focus on our other live trial, multiple live trials here on the Law and Crime Network. We're waiting to jump back in the Rosenbaum and Rosenbaum case. This is Jennifer and Joseph Rosenbaum, the foster parents who are accused of abusing two little girls and ultimately having that abuse lead to the death of one of them, little Layla Marie Daniel, a 2-year-old. This young girl's sister, who's now 7 years old, testified last week and said that Jennifer Rosenbaum would beat them, that she would spank them, even with a belt when they needed discipline. Pretty disturbing to hear, and also pretty remarkable to hear a 7-year-old take the stand. But right now, let's focus on some other testimony. We heard from Donald Cleveland, who's the Henry County coroner, to describe what exactly happened to Layla. If you haven't seen it, this is important. Watch.
Thanks.
Well, if you've been following us, this important witness agrees with our guest. Our guest, of course, Joseph Scott Morgan, forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University. The coroner agrees with you that these resuscitation efforts would not have led to what ultimately killed this young girl. Your thoughts on what we just heard?
Yeah, it's kind of straightforward, Jesse. He's looking at this child's body, I'm sure, at the scene, as many of us have as medical legal death investigators, and you take a look and you're scratching your head and you're thinking, wow, something it doesn't marry up here with the history that I'm being told and any kind of external manifestations that she may have. They've noted several resolving injuries that she had, which give you an indication that some trauma may very well be resolving and aging. So this is an indicative potentially of a thread, that runs through this poor little child's existence.
What is a transected pancreas if we're talking about blunt force trauma to the abdomen?
If folks at home will, if you'll find the base of your the left side of your rib cage, where your ribs literally end, and kind of parked way back into the midline of your abdomen. It's very, very deep. The pancreas is seated in this particular area. It's where, certain, like insulin is produced, this sort of thing, and in the body. And so it's very deep in the body. We generally see transected pancreas, which transected, it's a $10 word that literally means cut in two. Is literally broken apart. It takes a tremendous amount of force in order to facilitate this. We normally see something like a transected pancreas in a case where, for instance, we might have an automobile accident.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's interesting to hear, considering the fact that we're talking about a 2-year-old and not an adult as well. Just a horrible, horrible situation. And as we can hear so far, the medical testimony does not support the defense, but would support the prosecution. Now, I am getting word that the closing arguments have officially begun in the Roy Coons trial. So you know what we're going to do? We're going live. Let's go.